If you're a homeschooling parent, you know that it's very challenging, if not impossible. It's really an undertaking that is forced upon us by conditions that are not in our control. Ideally, we would be able to send our children to excellent local Catholic schools where just giving our children the support that they need in their studies and paying a tuition bill, a reasonable tuition bill, would be the fulfillment of our duty to provide our children with a Catholic education. But unfortunately, for most Catholics, that doesn't exist. It's not an option. And so we look at what the options are, and we see that we can send children to a public school, which is, for most students, a terrible option. I mean, for me as a father, I don't even understand what the point of Catholic parenting would be if I was to send my children for their education at a public school. I went to public school, and I can look back and say, oh, well, it wasn't so bad. Yeah, well, it wasn't so bad for me by the grace of God, but I can name classmates who are dead because of problems caused by the public education they received, the social connections that they gained through the public schools, fights at the public schools, and so on. I can name a classmate who was stabbed to death at a school dance. I could name 2 students who died of drug overdose who developed their drug problems while they were in public schools. So yeah, for me, it didn't take me down, but we could say that about anything. We could say that about drugs and violence themselves. We could say, well, drugs don't take everybody down. Some people make it through. So what, should we give drugs to everyone? That doesn't make any sense. So public schooling, as far as I'm concerned as a parent, is just not an option. The benefits, we could list benefits of sending the kids to public school, but the consequences, even though the consequences are, in philosophy, what we would call contingent, they're not necessary, but they're possible. Even though they're contingent and they're largely dependent upon choices that our children make as individuals, I would never want to live with the regret of thinking that I put my children into a situation where they faced temptations that they didn't have the strength to resist. And so it's a moral issue for me. It's a conscientious issue for me. And public school is not an option. Then when we look at other options, we have, non-Catholic private options like Protestant schools. And we can, again, list possible benefits of Protestant schools. But those benefits are going to come at costs. And again, in our generation where things are so ugly and gross morally, maybe sending a kid to a Protestant school seems relatively good. But if we think theologically or historically, it would be impossible for us to explain to a saint or doctor of the church that we were sending our children to a school run by people who believe in heretical ideas, positively believe in them, actively teach and promote them. That would be impossible to justify. And then there are, some private schools which are really just social clubs for wealthy families where they charge tuition that almost no one can afford. And they're just, like I said, they're social clubs. Those are the schools that I worked at before. It's just a way for wealthy parents in a community to ensure that their children only go to school with other children from wealthy families in the same community. Basically buying upper-class friends for your children. We look at all those options, and for most Catholic families, they're just not realistic options. And so homeschooling becomes the alternative to these things. And it's an impossible task when we consider what our goals might be, what we would like to accomplish through homeschooling, and what's realistically possible. And we've got to understand, as parents, we've got to understand what our duties are, because if we go into these things with unrealistic expectations, we're just going to torture ourselves. And we're going to create situations that are just as bad, if not worse, not by homeschooling, but by homeschooling with unrealistic expectations, unrealistic plans, and so on. And so my wife and I talk about this every day because it's a constant mental battle that we have to fight. I'm an intellectual person. I can sit and study all day, every day. My wife is a spiritually minded person. She can pray and study all day, every day. She has no interest in goofing around, wasting time, gossiping, idling around. I have no interest in those things. You can leave the two of us alone, and we'll work all day, every day. We're also 47 years old. And when we look down to our children, we've got a bunch of kids that we need to provide with an education, and they're all scatterbrained, weak, confused, sinful little kids, ages 7 up through 22, and I don't care how old they get. Childhood lingers on much later in life in this generation because of the way things are set up than it did in the past, and we have to accept that and deal with it. And so we have to have clear expectations, reasonable expectations, what we can actually accomplish, and no nonsense, no foolish homeschool conference talk, no watching movies and getting romantic ideas of what anything should look like, no reading fictional stories, no looking at Instagram posts at someone taking a photo on the best day of their homeschool life and pretending that that's what a normal Tuesday in October looks like. We have to be realistic, because this is a real battle, and we can just be consumed by the pressure of educating our children. It can eat away at us from inside. It can ruin our marriages, wreck our family finances, mess up businesses. It can have all kinds of destructive effects if we don't approach it reasonably and realistically. Now, what I talk to my wife about is the fact that the compulsory education laws that we're forced to deal with are artificial, and they are really the source of the trouble. There's an old English writer, I believe he wrote in the 1800s. His name was William Cobbett. He wrote a popular old book called The Cottage Economy, about old-fashioned English life and how the local village economy worked. And he explained that in human society, 90% of human beings are going to need to earn their living with manual work of some kind. They're not going to be intellectuals. They're not going to be officers. They're not going to be managers. They're going to have to find a place to do a job to earn a living. And that's true of 90% of the people alive. And 10% of them have the intellectual ability and just the providential circumstances that form their character, where they're going to be able to pursue an intellectual or managerial profession, where they're not the ones doing the work, they're the ones thinking and reading and planning and designing and inventing and so on. In modern society, however, we've decided to send everyone to school and make it compulsory for their entire childhood. This was never done in history, and we're just forced to deal with it. And when you live in a society with compulsory education laws, and the Catholic Church doesn't work to make Catholic education a priority for all Catholic families, you're stuck with this miserable situation where you've got to figure out what to do with all of your children because they all are required by law to attend school. And yet there are no great options, and homeschooling becomes a necessity. I want to emphasize that because parents need to understand that this problem is not a result of their own will or anything that they've done or anything that they've chosen. There's not something wrong with parents because they're not in a position to provide an excellent education at home. No one ever did in history. This situation is brought about by these crazy democratic American compulsory education laws, which just flip society upside down. And that's what causes these troubles. In the past, kids would have been sent out to work. Most parents themselves would be working their whole lives. Their children would join them in their manual work. And out of those children, some uniquely gifted individuals who had promise in studies and who had an interest in studying might be given the opportunity to go attend a school. A good example of this is St. John Bosco. Grew up in a poor farming family in Italy, but because of his virtue and his intellectual gifts, he was recognized by a priest and given the opportunity to go and attend a school. That's how it worked through history. A very small number of children went to school. Everyone else went to work. This was even true in early America. In the 1900s, this was true. Children were working. They weren't in school, and then compulsory education laws were passed, which forced the children into school. And again, that's not a problem when good schools exist. But when good schools don't exist, this becomes a real moral crisis. And that's what most of us face. We face a real moral crisis that, unfortunately, the leadership in the church is ignoring. Local priests, they ignore it. They don't want to undertake the work of education. And really, when we neglect the education of the kids, it just makes everything else kind of ridiculous. Faith formation class is not going to replace an education. And so the work is left to the parents, and the parents are willing to undertake the work. But the problem is that parents are not independently wealthy. When we have children, heaven doesn't send us all, free payments for the rest of our lives to cover the cost of all of the household expenses. We still have to work and earn a living, and that's hard enough as it is in a competitive capitalistic society. So we have to keep working. We're not free. We're not financially independent. And within the context of that work, we have to educate our children. And you see that this just becomes a nearly impossible task. And that's why it's so important for us to have realistic expectations and to go into it with no romantic fantasy ideas about what homeschooling needs to be. It's an emergency operation. And we need to understand what the priorities are and make sure we take care of those priorities and also not allow inevitable problems, necessary evils to discourage us because they're simply not in our control. And I'll give you some practical examples because this is a private discussion, and everyone listening, by subscribing to this Catholic Classicist site, we promise to keep these discussions confidential. That's not just discussions that I share, it's also any discussions we have on these issues. We're going to keep these things confidential among members only. In my family, we've got 10 children, ages 7 to 22. We've got 3 kids in college, one sort of in limbo between high school and college, and then the rest of the kids at home studying. There's no way for my wife and I to manage their time 24 hours a day, every day of the year. There's no way for us to supervise every minute of their activity every day, and therefore we've got to ask ourselves, what are our duties as parents? What do we owe our children in terms of work that we need to do, provision that we need to make, and so on? What are the unnecessary evils that we're going to have to bear with patiently because there's simply no other option? And we've got to choose. We've got to choose our battles and choose the evil that we're going to allow, because at some point, something has to be allowed. And we've got to think about what's going to be allowed and what's not going to be allowed. We've got to choose our battles. And it's difficult, but we have to be realistic, or else if we're perfectionist in this, we'll just end up losing everything or quitting, as many do. And we'll just end up sending the kids into a situation that's worse because we exaggerated the problems that we had to deal with. So, for example, I've worked to provide my children with a complete classical Catholic education at no cost to them that they have access to 24 hours a day. Absolutely speaking, I know that I've provided for my children in an extraordinary way, in a way that goes far beyond anything that I owe them as a matter of the duty of parents. That doesn't make the kids study it, though. That doesn't make the kids appreciate it. That doesn't make the kids do the work. It also is accessible to them online, and so we've got to deal with all of the challenges of online distractions. And thanks be to God, my kids are pretty decent morally. We don't have to deal much with any scandalous, immoral things. And the internet is actually, very, very safe for kids. You've really got to dig and seek things out to find any dirty stuff. And as long as there's some supervision and kids are kept in open areas together, that kind of stuff, pornography, things like that, are not going to be very common. Those things happen more in private, when kids are allowed to have access to things unsupervised, without any accountability, in private for a long period of time. So what we have to deal with our kids is the constant interest in games on the internet or chatting with other kids and stuff like that. I hate it, but at the same time, I've got to consider what the alternatives are. And I could sit there and hover over the kids 24 hours a day and try to catch them every time they start playing a game, but it's an inevitable evil, and it's not that big of a deal. And when I consider that this is the evil that I've got to deal with, so that I can eliminate the other evils, I have to be realistic and say, I can't keep out everything. And if I'm going to let in one thing or two things that I simply can't control everything, to let in these two things is really not a big deal. And if I were to be a perfectionist and to go beyond that and go overboard, I think that everything would fall apart. It would be miserable and impossible. And so I don't care about these childish things. I don't care if the kids waste time playing some dopey games, silly, little things, nothing even significant. I don't care if the kids are chatting with other kids playing these games during the day. If that's the evil that I've got to grant, I think that's a good situation. And I'm willing to grant that in order to avoid the other evils and have a homeschool arrangement that's sustainable. And I use planners with my wife. We use a weekly planner for our kids to lay out tasks for them, and we want to see that they're making progress week by week. And outside of that, we don't fuss too much. We set that as our standard. We would like to see progress in each course, in each subject area, each week. And as long as we see that, as far as their schooling is concerned, the time that they have for studies, as long as we see that there's progress in their subjects, and the time that they waste is spent on childish things, watching a video, looking up news, playing a video game on the internet, whatever. As long as it's relatively innocent, childish stuff, it's really not that big of a deal. They'd have much worse if they were in school because all of those chats would be going on anyway, but with present students. So we accept that as sort of a cleaned up or filtered form of evil that's inevitable. And we don't fuss about that. We just focus on the positives. And this leads to the biggest challenge in homeschooling. The biggest challenge in homeschooling, in parenting in general, but in homeschooling in particular, is learning how to be patient as a parent. Not being a ranting, angry hypocrite, but learning to just be realistic. Mind your own business. Get your work done. Keep yourself calm. Focus on work that you have to do as a father or as a mother. Take care of your business. Give the kids a break. Realize that the situation is not ideal. Don't micromanage the kids. Don't blow up every time some little thing goes wrong. But stay focused on general, positive objectives each week. Be patient. Think back to your own childhood. Remember the things that you did as a child, even the foolishness and the silliness. Understand that your kids are immature. They don't have prudence. They don't have experience. They're not going to make prudent adult decisions when they're 12 years old. And that's not sinful. That's just normal. It's childish. St. Paul said, "When I was a child, I spoke as a child. Now that I'm a man, I speak as a man." That's natural development. Your children are not supposed to be 40-year-olds in 12-year-old bodies. The childishness is a natural part of life. And as parents, especially as homeschooling parents, we have to learn to chill out, to be patient. One of the works of mercy is to bear wrongs patiently, to be patient. Look at the example God provides us of patience. He's not screaming at us 24 hours a day. He doesn't blow the world up every time someone opens a silly book or wastes time reading the news. God's patient with us. He knows that we're weak. He deals with us as weak creatures. He knows that we're influenced by evil influences that are not in our control, things that we don't necessarily choose. And he deals with us patiently and mercifully, forgiving our sins and always giving us the opportunity to repent. I just talked about this in another talk posted on the Catholic Classicist site on real manliness based on what we read in the Book of Wisdom. We have to chill out. We have to have goals, clear objectives. We have to really establish these objectives in our minds, what the essential things are that we need to do as parents. And we need to realize that we can't do everything. There are going to be evils that we simply cannot keep out, but we can control what evils they are. And we have to learn to be realistic in this work so that perfectionism doesn't cause the whole thing to blow up and make everyone miserable and bring about evils that are 100 times worse than sending the kids to public school would have been. And I see homeschool families do this all the time. They're so foolish and unrealistic in their expectations because they listen to all this salesman homeschool conference talk, and they get all their expectations, raised up to the heavens, and then they accomplish none of those things, and the whole thing falls apart, and they crash and burn as a family. And the kids end up in worse situations than they would have been in had they just been sent to a public school from the beginning. There are homeschool suicides. These things are just ridiculous, and it's because homeschool parents don't understand the source of the stress. They don't have realistic expectations. They often go in arrogant and, filled with pride, talking about all the things they're going to do, and they just crash and faceplant and make fools of themselves and cause far greater trouble than they would have had just sending kids to a public school. We can avoid all that and actually give our kids a good experience if we set realistic objectives and focus on specific positive goals that are our duties as parents, and identify undesirable evils which will allow in order to avoid greater evils. And I learned an example of this from the life of Saint Teresa of Avila. Saint Teresa of Avila, as a kid, she said that one of the things she struggled with morally, it was a source of sin in her life, was that her mother kept romance books. And we're not talking about modern, immoral romance books. We're just talking about romantic stories. Her mother kept romantic stories, and she allowed the children to read them. And when Saint Teresa got older, they became a distraction for her spiritually. They became a source of, I wouldn't say sin, but just difficulty in Saint Teresa's life. And Saint Teresa talked about how she wished that she didn't have to deal with that as a child. She wished she wasn't introduced to those stories. But then she explains that her mother used or allowed those stories so that she could avoid the children seeking and getting access to worse things. So the mother considered those romantic stories a source that would entertain the children and satisfy their interest in some sort of pleasurable reading or, silliness, but would limit it, rather than trying to restrict everything and having them seek out things that are worse. And this is what often happens in homeschools. Parents will try to limit everything instead of identifying a reasonable limit where things aren't ideal, but they're not as evil as they can be. And when parents set absolute standards, the kids often slip around them. And when the kids slip around them, they end up with worse things. For example, the common issue is pornography. They'll slip around rules about what books you can read or what videos you can watch. They'll slip around that. And when they finally do get some free time or access to something, they go right for the worst stuff that they can get their hands on. Whereas if they were allowed to have some time to read something that was not necessarily scripture or a prayer book, but to some degree gratifying for a desire of interesting story reading or something like that, or a show that was funny and entertaining, just enough to gratify that desire and prevent them from seeking something more extremely evil. That's a strategy that prudent parents would learn to use, because if we will grant a degree of silliness, we can prevent an explosion or some unbounded, ridiculous situation that could be avoided by just calming those desires, by allowing them some gratification. Just like playtime. Playtime, when we let our kids play, it's foolishness. But we do it just to get some energy out, get some foolishness out, let them run around, yell, breathe, make some noise, sweat a little bit, bang around and wrestle. We let them get that out so that they can be calm. We don't try to keep them calm 24 hours a day. Of course, some do. Crazy people will do that. They'll try to keep the kids locked down and silent and calm 24 hours a day. And those are the kids that blow up. But normally, we give our kids an opportunity to do some things to vent or to get that out so they can be calm when they need to be calm. And we need to think about these things prudently and realistically, because the alternative to just lock down everything, it's not going to work. And the results are likely going to be worse than they would be had we granted some leniency with the rules. So these are prudential issues, and these are the kind of things that need to be discussed among faithful Catholic parents privately, which is the purpose of this site and keeping these resources private. So I'd like for us to be able to talk about these things. If there are specific questions or issues that you face, I'd like you to ask about them. I'd like us to talk about them because we share them. I'm not going to get into every issue in a talk, but we share these issues. They're common. And we need to be able to strategize and think through them realistically so that we don't make dopey mistakes that we could have avoided by being, as the scripture warns, too righteous, by being over righteous. We have to make sure that we're balanced and realistic. We have to understand that our kids, if they're going to be saints, it's going to be because God's grace is at work in their souls. It's not going to be because we ruled over them so strictly, so constantly that they were never allowed. No one becomes a saint like that. To be a saint, you must will it. Without the will, there's no sanctity. And we have to understand that that depends on God's grace. And we have to focus on our own duties as parents, not obsessing with our children's duties. We have to fulfill our own duties. And we have to think about how to do that practically, because this work of homeschooling is humanly impossible, especially when we go into it with romantic and perfectionist ideas. This is what caused homeschools to raise these weirdo Dracula kids. I call them homeschool vampires. They act like they've never been around human beings because their parents have restricted them so much that they can't even function in normal social circles. And that's an alternative that no one should desire. Those situations are terrible. We can't raise these socially mutilated children that we boast about because they've never read a bad book or talked to a bad person or saw a bad thing, and yet they're socially inside out unhappy people that we can't explain what they're going to do with their adult lives the way that they've been raised. That's not the solution. That's not the solution. And so we have to learn how to parent and educate our children in a homeschooling environment responsibly, with balance, so that we put our children in position to be happy as adults. And we have to seek for them the grace that will allow them to live and make good use of freedom in this life, which is the purpose of our lives. That's the goal, for us to make reasonable use of the freedom that God has given us, not to take away people's freedom, but to teach them and train them, to disciple them in understanding why they should use their freedoms responsibly, and they should resist temptations and avoid evils for the real reasons, not because mommy's watching or because daddy is going to take away your dinner, but because it's simply in your best interest to live a virtuous life. That's the goal of parenting and discipleship and homeschooling, and we have to go about that goal with strategy, having our minds right, getting these things clear in our minds so that we don't go crazy, we don't torment ourselves as homeschooling parents. So let's discuss these things. If there are specific issues you'd like to get into, raise them in the comments and we'll chat about them. And again, these discussions will all be private among members only. God bless.